Good morning, everybody. I'm glad to see that we still have some people here. We always know that a lot of people can't get flights out and have to leave before this Thursday's sessions, but glad to see a few awake faces out in the audience there. This is our last day, of course, and we thank you all for coming. I wanted to mention that I thought Sarah did a great job wrapping up yesterday for us, and hopefully you got a little different perspective than you usually do. And I think this morning you're also going to get a little different perspective, a little information that is typically not in the IR guidelines, the sight lines, what you're familiar with. So I think you'll enjoy this session, and I'm going to turn it over to Randy Weber, our Vice President for Student Success here at JCCC, to introduce our speaker.
Well, I'm going to save the main stage for our speaker. As Lou said, I'm Randy Weber. I'm Vice President for Student Success and Engagement here. Student Services and Enrollment Management. Today's speaker, this morning's speaker, is Mike Reilly. He's the Executive Director of, I have to make sure I say it right, American Association of Collegiate Registrars and Admissions Officers. ACRO is frequently how we refer to them. ACRO is a strong partner in admissions and recruitment and records and enrollment management overall. As we look at data and try to synthesize what we do, Mike and his team do a terrific job of kind of helping direct some of our efforts in there. A couple of their annual conferences really bring a lot of the leaders in our industry together to kind of figure out how we do that. Today's presentation he's got titled College Experience is More Than Courses and Grades, How Comprehensive Student Records Are Changing the Way We Document Student Learning. And that's going to be a really big thing where I think we'll all be pretty excited to hear a little bit about some of the work that ACRO's doing working with NASPA. But a little bit about Mike. Like I said, he's currently the Executive Director of ACRO. He serves as the executive, prior to coming to ACRO, he served as the Executive Director of the Council of Presidents, an association of the 6 public baccalaureate degree granting institutions in the state of Washington. He has 25 years of experience in university administration, admissions, and enrollment management, including having the Associate Vice President for Enrollment Management at both Central Washington and at Humboldt State University. He recently served as the ACE Board of Directors and is currently on the ACE's Commission on Education Attainment and Innovation in the College Board's Access and Diversity Collaborative Advisory Council. He's frequent writer and speaker on public policy matters impacting higher education. He earned a bachelor's degree from Iowa State University and completed grad work in anthropology at Washington State University. His record of community service beyond higher education is extensive, including serving on boards at the Chamber of Commerce, United Way, and Ellensburg Gallery 1 in Washington. Beyond that, if you want to ask him about fishing, he has got quite a few stories there too, so we'll have to test his facts and data today. With that said, Mike Reilly.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I really enjoyed being here for the last couple of days. I've known about this conference for a number of years, and a little bit of irony that it's here at Johnson County Community College, because the president of the ACRO board, Paul Kyle, is here at Johnson County Community College. So I'm not only speaking to you, I'm hanging out with my boss while I'm here. And Randy serves on one of our advisory groups. We have a group of community college leaders helping us, particularly around strategic enrollment management. We're seeing a lot more community college representatives coming to our community, our SEN meeting. And so we're talking with him and some of his colleagues about what are some of the issues that might resonate and be helpful with community colleges. So I'm going to talk about this. The college experience is more than grades and courses and grades. So this is a project that we have been working on for the last year or so, and we think it's going to have an impact on the work that takes place on colleges and universities because there's just a bit of a clamoring for it. So just a little bit about us. ACRO, we have 11,000 members in about 2,600 colleges and universities in 40 countries. Our members are primarily registrars, admissions officers. Oh, I'm sorry. He says, I don't think we did. Do you notice the royal we? Mike, I don't think we turned your mic on. Very nice of you not to say, Mike, turn on your mic. Registrars, admissions officers, and chief enrollment officers. And we have been around a long time. We have been around 106 years. This is what we looked like in 1930 at our conference in Nashville, Tennessee. You know, you always think of registrars as being very gregarious, welcoming, opening, you know, people like this. I think this was actually my registrar. You know, so we had only registrars until the 1940s, and then the organization expanded, and we've added admissions folks, and over time, kind of the early group to get involved in strategic enrollment management. We've had an annual conference for 25 years now. So what we have been working on, we received a $1.6 million grant from Lumina and jointly filed this with NASPA. And the goal of our project is to accelerate the creation of a comprehensive student record. So we were looking for schools that were already doing some interesting things in terms of learning outcomes, competencies, co-curricular experiences. Our goal wasn't to go out there and try to get schools to start thinking about those frameworks, but to work with schools that were already doing some of that, who wanted to try and figure out, once you do that, how do you convert that into a record that students can share? So that was our work. So we're looking to create a framework. When we come out of this project, we hope to be able to deliver to schools 3 to 5 models of what we think might be promising practices for campuses to evaluate. So we want to really focus on, you know, documenting the operational and policy considerations. One thing about our organization, we are very practical, process-oriented people. We have lots of registrars. You know how they are. So, you know, a lot of our stuff is not theoretical. It's, you know, actual practical applications to try and solve problems and improve services. So we're going to try very hard to document, you know, if you have Banner, how do you do this? If you're a PeopleSoft school, what are the issues that you might face? And Lumen has also asked us to look at this issue of documenting the credit hour, whether it limits the ability of campuses to do competency-based education in particular. So because of that, we're looking, you'll see that some of our schools are very much at the forefront of competency-based education. So what we were thinking about here, when we talk about this comprehensive record, we started out calling this an extended transcript, but realized that had a little bit of baggage with it because, you know, particularly amongst our registrars, they were really thinking we're talking about going in and really completely throwing out the transcript and replacing it with something different. When in fact, you know, many of these projects that will take place, the transcript portion will likely retain a lot of its current attributes because, you know, despite all the critics, the transcript has some functional purposes, particularly within the academy. You know, graduate chairs know how to read a transcript, they know how to evaluate an applicant. You know, we talk about how bad transcripts are, but, you know, 40-some% of students earn their first credential at the second school that they attended. Some, almost 30%, do it at the third school, so it does facilitate some of that work. But what we were looking at are schools that are looking at learning outcomes and competencies in particular, and then schools that are looking at co-curricular experiences. So those are some of the other learning that we wanted to bring into the mix. And of course, because this is a Lumina-funded project, they were very interested in us looking to see if we can work with some degree qualification profile schools. And so we've tried to do that, although this is one of those things you talk about the difference between theoretical and operational. There are a lot of schools doing the degree qualifications profile, at least they say they are doing the degree qualifications profile. But we had difficulty finding schools that actually deconstructed programs, you know, built around those outcomes, created assessments, assignments, et cetera, that we could then pull into a record. So hopefully what we're doing with this is helping with that. Now, co-curricular stuff, that's been going on for a long time. And certainly from the student affairs side, there's a lot of interest in trying to bring some of those learning experiences into a record. Right now, there's a lot of third-party vendors that work with colleges to document that, but it's basically a it's a document that might be something like a e-portfolio. It's not, authorized by the institution. It's not an institutionally sanctioned document. So bringing some of that into the mix. So just a little bit of the timeline of this project. We went to a convening that Lumina had in 2014. Heard about some of these ideas, and there are some vendors that are trying to get into this space too very quickly. And I'll be perfectly honest, that was part of our desire to get into this, was before the vendors get out there with all their solutions, perhaps the practitioners might want to sit down and think about what are the considerations that we'll be doing. What are faculty interested in? What works well for the institutions? So we put together a white paper. We have what we call a member source track that we did at our meeting, where we did a really deep dive into this, applied for this grant, got a $1.3 million grant from them to begin with 8 schools. We added 4 schools, so we did a convening of those schools. We're doing campus consultations right now. We hope to be able to publish these findings in December of 2016, so it's a pretty quick turnaround. So these are our institutions. We tried to make sure we had a broad range of institutions of type and from around the country. We have a couple of community colleges in the mix. One of our community colleges, we were originally working with Quinsigamond in Massachusetts, but they had a labor dispute that took place, and so none of the folks working on the project were able to work on this, so we added the Borough of Manhattan Community College. So we've got some publics, some privates, small, large. We do have several schools. University of Maryland University College this is not College Park, this is their adult serving institution. They have something like 90,000 students. It's a big institution. And then we also have the University of Wisconsin Extension and Wisconsin Colleges. They run the community colleges in the state of Wisconsin, but also the Wisconsin Extension, and that's the program that's doing a direct assessment flex program. So that's a really creative project because there's no terms, there's no courses, there's no grades. What does that record look like? So we've got a pretty good mix of institutions to try and explore here. So why are we doing this now? I've got to go through a couple of slides here to see what's driving some of this. Assessment of learning is accreditation is requiring now that you have learning outcomes. You talk about the outcomes of your students. So, what does that mean? And, are you just saying that in your report to your regional accreditor, or does that stuff start to migrate into what you want to present with your graduates as part of their experience? Technology's really changed. It allows us to do things quite a bit differently. You'll see, we'll focus a little bit on the move from paper. If you do digital records, you would be surprised what sort of opportunities present themselves in a digital environment. We have folks, one of the reasons for trying to bring in some of these co-curricular experiences, we have lots of students that are presenting themselves on the places like LinkedIn, self-reported, here's what we do. A lot of students want to have those experiences validated by the institution. So they want to be able to say, it's not just me saying this, my institution has validated that I have done this and can do this. And there's beginning to be a more widespread acceptance that learning happens beyond the classroom. The other thing driving this, you all know this, there's this huge list of folks questioning the value of higher education, questioning our outcomes, questioning whether we're doing things right. Some of them from, good work that folks like George Koo is doing about, we haven't really been focusing on learning. But then you have folks like Kevin Carey, who's, basically said the model's broken. We're basically like the old steel industry. We're not keeping up with the times. So, it's clear that institutions, kind of what Rick Torres was telling yesterday, are not necessarily telling our story right. So we really do need to do some things to better be able to describe the value that we've added for students, the learning that's been acquired, and what they can do as we start to focus, perhaps too much, but we can't deny that people want us to focus on career, how your college experience prepares you for a career. Just to say,
you have a rich liberal arts experience, doesn't quite hold as much value anymore. And then, of course, we do have people like Kevin Carey. You can't talk about transcripts without throwing in a good Kevin Carey quote. He hates these things. My favorite thing is credible evidence of learning needs to be liberated from the bureaucratic clutches of the registrar and made available to students so they can present it to others that they choose. You see Charlton Heston with that gun, "You will take this transcript out of my cold, dead hands." The irony about this is that many of our registrars are some of the most innovative folks trying to move this in a new direction. But, okay, we'll take it. We get it, Kevin. The other thing out here is we're working through this. I always love this slide from EduVentures, and this is probably a year old. They've probably added 25 or 30 companies to this thing. The print's going to get smaller and smaller. I mean, this is the landscape that we in higher education have to navigate to try and put solutions together for delivering your services, providing advising, registering students, communicating, et cetera. So one of the goals of this project is to try and work through all of these things and see how you can pull data from these various systems into a record. Everything's not sitting in your student information system anymore. And so that's becoming one of the big challenges that we're working through. So one of the other things that we're going to require as part of this, and it will help us with this cause, is delivering records electronically. We want these projects, all of these, to be digital records. And just a little bit of history, ACRO in 1988 formed the Standardization of Post-Secondary Electronic Educational Data Exchange, the SPEEDY Committee, in 1988. And they were charged with trying to develop some standards around the possibility of exchanging electronic records. So in 1991, 25 years ago, our SPEEDY Committee in ACRO developed the SPEEDY EDI, the Electronic Data Interchange. So that was the first standard for exchanging records. And about a year later, put together a secure server at the University of Texas at Austin for those records to flow through. So that, for 20-some years, millions of not just student records, but applications, all sorts of data flowed through that. And just 2 years ago, the National Student Clearinghouse took over that server. So that's when you hear Rick Torres talk about all the work that they're doing, a lot of these digital records are flowing through there. So we thought we'd survey our members last year and just see, after 25 years, how are we doing with this move to adoption of electronic exchange of records. And you're going to have this machine-readable data. You can automate business processes. Well, as you can see, paper still rules. 99.4% of institutions say they accept paper. And that doesn't mean that's their predominant form, but they do. 31%, so 1 in 3, can receive an EDI or XML transcript, XML being the other digital standard for exchange. And one kind of positive thing that 75% of schools are accepting PDFs. Now PDFs are great. It does at least reduce the mail. It's environmentally friendly, et cetera. But it doesn't automate business processes. You would be surprised how many institutions receive a PDF, pull it up on their computer, print it, run it through their optical character recognition software to try and load it into their degree audit. That happens all the time. And this other, I'm not sure if this is, the 7.3 is like fax, maybe dictated over the phone. Yeah, Tom got to be in that class, okay. I'm not sure what those are. So then this issue about, have people taken advantage of the ability to electronically receive data and automate business processes? Well, not very well. Just over 1 in 10 institutions are using this electronic data to do a transfer articulation. And when I was in the state of Washington as an admissions director, this was probably, I think when this went into effect, 2003, maybe 2004, the community colleges up there announced to all the baccalaureates, you have 2 choices to receive our transcripts. You can either receive them all electronically or all paper. We're going to do one or the other. So I don't think they were using EDI, but they were using a comma delimited file. And we said, we'll take them electronically. The very first day, we got the batch of community college transcripts from the 34 community and technical colleges to come to us, load into our server, dump into DARS, automatically do all the degree audits in about 10 minutes. We just thought that is magic. And yet we have very few schools taking advantage of this. Now, part of it is these student information systems have not been very good about it. You can do XML or EDI automated loads into things like Banner or PeopleSoft, but it does take some work. But we're hoping this project helps accelerate some of that. So this isn't very clear to see, but this is a transcript. Isn't it a thing of beauty? I mean, this is what's got everybody so riled up. Kind of a conventional transcript in a paper format. Again, it does the job it's primarily been designed to do. And the reason it looks like it does, we will take some of the blame for why it looks like it does, because for probably 50 years we've been publishing a document called the Academic Record and Transcript Guide, which talks about best practices for what should be in a transcript. But registrars didn't make this up. I mean, this looks like it does because it's basically been the convergence of how faculty deliver the academy. I mean, we deliver our courses and grades, and that's sort of been how it works. So it ends up looking like this. Now, interestingly, and you know this, most students don't use the transcript as their means of tracking their progress toward their degrees. They use these degree audits. How many of you have looked at a degree audit? They are not very fun. And it sort of raises this issue about, it's no wonder our students come out not necessarily thinking about the learning outcomes, because what really matters is whether you've checked the right boxes in this degree audit. And it's been a nice tool. It lets faculty not be so worried about looking at what requirements the student has fulfilled, and can talk about your career plans and other things, but it does sort of just make it really rote. And so this is actually one of the things that we have to figure out when we're working on these comprehensive records, is what happens to the degree audit. If you try to shift this process to have students thinking more about learning outcomes and competencies, and yet you tell them what really matters is whether you have the boxes checked, we've sort of defeated the purpose. This is interesting because it gets at this question of pathways. This is what a lot of people will say. This is what we hand to a student instead of saying, this is what you need. Choose from one. I think one of these categories has 46 classes as a choice. Choose two of these 46 classes. And it's sort of how we've constructed the academy and through general education, and not necessarily particularly student focused. I also like, and I think the print is small here, but final responsibility for meeting graduation and transfer requirements stated in your degree audit rests with you. So what might an alternative to that look like? So this is a very early version of this, and I understand it's changed quite a bit. This is Northern Arizona's first sort of mock-up of what their competency report would look like. Northern Arizona is going to have it's going to be a direct assessment program, but they are going to map their work to courses. That's one of the problems that we're having. The Department of Education, I think of the Tom Waits song, the large print giveth and the small print taketh away. They're trying to let you do competency-based education, but say when you report to financial aid, you must do that in the form of courses and grades and satisfactory academic progress. So even places like Western Governors University are mapping their work to courses to be able to do it. But this is what they're proposing, kind of the early iteration of it. And I really like it. I mean, it shows what the competency is, describes it in detail. You can see if somebody's transfers, that's one of the issues that we have to deal with in the US, is all the mobility. Now, one thing that we did a lot of work trying to see what other people are doing is we went to the UK several times. They have what they call their HERE report, and it's a diploma supplement, It's part of the Bologna compliance project that they're doing for Europe. So most schools, in addition to their, I guess you'd call it a transcript, but it's not grades, these are modules that they do in the UK. They've all agreed on a 6-bucket standardized form that lists the degree, lists the outcomes, has the transcript or the modular report. It has this section 6, which allows the institutions to build co-curricular experiences or other learning. And then that document gets created into a digital format when the student graduates. Now, the advantage for them is nobody transfers in the UK. So when you have the learning outcomes, they're just the learning outcomes of the program when it's completed. Well, we have this messy thing called transfer. You know, what do you do when a student from Northern Arizona tries to take this to your community college and says, I have, 2 of the outcomes of work in a team structure done. What do I have left to get my associate's degree? Well, that's part of the problem. But they've got a kind of interesting idea, for showing when you've completed these, when you've mastered them, what's remaining. So this is just, kind of a start. I'm going to show you some of the projects, some of the things we're working on with the 12 schools that we have here. And again, these are all works in progress. Not sure how well these will resonate, but some pretty interesting ideas. So Elon in North Carolina, private institution, has one of the highest participation in study abroad of any school in the country. About 85% of their graduates did a study abroad experience. And their office is a residential, traditional campus. So all those things that are important. They decided they wanted to try and capture some of those as part of the student's record. So their initial attempt at this was to create it in a very standard transcript format. This was produced by Parchment, who's one of the big companies for transcript exchange, and it's done in a very traditional format. It's in a machine-readable format so that, this could be exchanged. Now, if you think we have trouble articulating courses, how do you articulate this? Well, we've got some ideas on the horizon. So what they decided to do, just to make it a little more user-friendly, was to convert all of this into an infographic format. So what they do now, and yet this actually isn't a very good snapshot of this, it's more colorful. They've created, what they're doing at Elon is trying to capture basically the high-impact practices that are put out by George Koo in some of his work. Things like service, global education, leadership, research, internships. And those are some of the things that we find as we talk to campuses. Those resonate with a lot of people. In fact, a lot of schools already do some of that, and they capture it probably through a pseudo course on their transcript. But Elon has decided to really emphasize this and put it on a timeline. It's a 2-page document, to show their study abroad. They actually have it as a spot on the map so you can see where it is. They're beginning to get permission from quite a few companies who did the internship so that the company logo will be there as part of the internship. The future of this, these will all be digital links so that you can link onto that and go in for deeper information and look about what the internship involved, what the project was. If the student didn't do a particular activity, the infographic scales, so it's not left as a blank. If you only did 2 things, those are bigger. This is getting a lot of interest. They make it very easy to upload to LinkedIn, so if a student wants to put something up as their profile. They've surveyed quite a few employers who said, this would be a nice addition to a resume for me. I can very quickly, in 2 pages, get a pretty good understanding of the breadth and interest of this student. One of the other schools that we're working with is Stanford. Now, Stanford, it's kind of interesting. Somebody said, well, yeah, Stanford really needs to do a lot of work to demonstrate the value of their degree for their graduates. And they said, well, we don't want to rest on our laurels either. It's important for us to be thinking this through too. So they're part of this project. We thought they have a lot of things going on. It's partly because their registrar, Tom Black, is a pretty innovative guy. He likes to point out and harass all the vendors and say, you guys got to get on, you're backing up my sewer. That's his line, because he says, I'm doing all this digital stuff, and your technology doesn't allow for it. So get on with it. Come on, you got to enable us here. So he's really focused on validation of the learning that comes from the campuses, making them digital, basically doing a better job of not just simply that you have a Stanford degree, but what did you learn, what can you do? So one of the things that he discovered, the graduate programs at Stanford awards something like 160 different certificates that the registrar's office has nothing to do with. They are produced by the department. Perhaps the dean of that college might put it out, and it's mostly done on a Word document that somebody prints off at the secretary's desk in the department and hands out that you have this certificate from Stanford. And Tom just thought, well, we could probably be a little more formal about that. So he's created this process where he's actually filed with us and several other groups to create an e-certificate standard through PESC. PESC is the P20 Electronic Standards Council that works with all of the digital standards for the exchange of records. So what he's trying to provide this as a carrot to the department to say, instead of you doing that, if you work with me, I will create this digital document for you so that you can be issued by the institution. What's interesting about this is this one, that same certificate has broken it down into learning outcomes and kind of describes what takes place underneath each of those. Again, this will be, right now it's a PDF that will have an XML header on it so that you can index it and automate some things, but it is still a PDF. He proposes, instead of that document that comes out from on the printer from the college, to make it an actual digital document that has this indexed embedded header that links back to their system so that they can do a validation process so that the student can request this in a secure manner and exchange it. And they are doing this through this credential trust company. But again, we're going to build a standard around this so that any campus that wants to create a e-certificate, and that could be an e-badge, anything you want to do, you'll be able to do it in this format and securely exchange it. So this, again, this lead corporation innovation has topics, learning outcomes, another version of this to be able to go and drill into what that student learned and can do. Much more robust. Again, this is what you were getting before, was a certificate printed that said you have this thing. And you hope that the recipient, I guess, just knew that it was from Stanford and it had value. But now you're able to drill in and find out all of the learning outcomes and things that went into that. Now, one other thing that he worked on, so Tom's trying to get the faculty at Stanford to think about outcomes. And some of them have looked at the degree qualifications profile. I think there's some reticence in adopting that. One of my thing about this, I really like what Lumen is doing, but it's pretty clear faculty in many cases are a little bit resistant to having a national framework. Well, that's imposed on them, but they want to be able to develop this themselves. So it's been a little slower in adoption. But what Tom did was put together, I'm not sure what framework he used, but pulled a set of learning outcomes and got a number of faculty and departments to sit down and sort of deconstruct their programs based on these learning outcomes. And they piloted this with a couple of programs. And what he discovered, which is kind of interesting, is that he has two students. Charlie, remember I get this. Charlie was a computer science graduate, and Sam is a philosophy graduate of Stanford. And they discovered that they have 4 of the same 5 learning outcomes from a philosophy and a computer science major. I mean, all these kinds of things that you want the computer science graduate to do, those are many of the same skills you want from a philosophy graduate. And interestingly, the philosophy grad, I guess, is actually working in Silicon Valley with companies developing business process analysis. And the computer science grad is doing kind of a gap year thing in Thailand, kind of working his way around the country doing projects for pay. But what was interesting about, I think it really put a light bulb off in some of the liberal arts faculty, just saying, we've been struggling a little bit to be able to articulate that our degrees have the same kinds of values in terms of outcomes. And so I think you're going to see a number of departments at Stanford get on board with this. The other thing that they're doing at Stanford, and this is another part of this project that's sort of a little bit of a tangent, but it makes sense. When you start producing lots of documents and evidence and records and artifacts, where do you put those things and how do students get them? Well, what Stanford's putting together is this notion called My Locker. So they're building this repository where students can put documents of their learning or anything that they've done on campus, sort of validated by the institution, but it goes into this locker and then it becomes the students. And so when you graduate, 3 years later and your Stanford ID number doesn't work anymore and you can't get into the system, through this you can access it through any of the standard formats and go back and release these documents to anybody you want. So Tom, what kind of things that he's thinking about, he's trying to produce these, we think about a lot of people saying, well, you need to be doing this for employers. They're the folks that have the problems. Well, we actually think if the focus of your efforts are on students first, that everything will work out sort of in the end if it works for students. So really designed for students, wants these to be portable. Tom's really focused on validation, non-repudiating. When you get this from Stanford through our process, it's an authenticated document. Wants them both human and machine readable. Talking about what was the learning that was intended, what was achieved. And wants them always to be accessible, but also ones that fit in with the traditional offerings of the academy so that you're not throwing the baby out with the bathwater here when you try something new. One of our schools, South Carolina, and I don't know quite as much about what they're doing at their project, but they have really gotten into trying to create a holistic student learning environment in addition to the classroom, what takes place outside the classroom. They're setting this up there so that they can track students' participation in the activities and ultimately the outcomes. Creating a data warehouse. This is one of the issues that we're confronting, and it's, should resonate with you folks who are data folks. We're having some real struggles on finding the data to pull into a record. And even things like competencies. If you decide to get to a competency framework, where are those retained at your institution? Some people have set them up in Excel files. A lot of people are doing the co-curricular stuff in a third-party product wasn't necessarily designed to integrate with your SIS. A lot of things happening in the learning management systems, and of course the student information systems were not designed when learning management systems were not around. And learning management systems aren't quite as data extraction friendly. My friend calls them the Hotel California. You can check in whenever you like, but you can never leave. You're not indexed to the student ID, so that's one of the challenges that's happening. So we're getting a lot of people creating these tools to be able to be sort of an interface between their many systems as a place to extract data into a record. And part of this, I think this is a really important part of this project too. While we are thinking about this as a comprehensive record, implying that it's a summative document, many of our campuses are trying to make sure that this has significant formative components to it. It isn't just when you leave, here we're going to hand you a record that says what you learned. The idea of trying to do this is that students are constantly thinking about the learning objectives and the outcomes as they're going through their work, knowing that some of their course selections or activity selections will impact this record, being able to see these documents that you're building as you go along. Because I think if you don't do that, you've sort of missed the opportunity. If we're going to really shift to students being able to articulate what they know and can learn, you've got to make it a formative exercise. UW Flex. So UW Flex, this is our direct assessment institution in the mix. Again, and by that we mean no grades, no courses, no terms. These are modules of learning that students can access at their own pace. When they feel they're capable, they take the assessment. When they complete the assessment, they can move on to the next section. You may have noticed that our conventional student information systems are built on terms and courses. That's how they function. So we're actually seeing this kind of interesting move of new companies trying to enter this space that are able to do these kinds of deliveries in a non-term format. The one that I think is getting the most traction right now is Salesforce. They're basically using the CRM of Salesforce. That's what they're doing here at UW, to build a kind of user interface to students to be able to do this. Eventually, they've got to migrate it over to PeopleSoft because that's what Wisconsin uses. But trying to use the PeopleSoft as your means of the user interface for students for a non-term-based approach isn't working very well. So they're self-paced, no set path, completely new roles for the faculty and staff as part of this. They're trying to build this new student engagement system. Again, this is going to be a Salesforce-backed program to deal with admissions, bursar, et cetera. Right now, the business model, it is self-supporting, so they're hoping it scales sufficiently to be able to continue to finance it. And there's no direct state support, although I think Wisconsin, that's increasingly becoming the standard for all forms of delivery of education. So they have, just as an example, their RN to BSN, they've got 8 competency sets that's what their students are going to complete. And so, the underpinnings of this are some sort of assessment, activity, project to be able to demonstrate that. If you look at chronic care management, for example, there's a number of assessment projects that the student completes to be able to see, once you do that, you have the chronic care management competency. It's not markedly different than we may be doing things now, but it's just a little more clearly defined. As they're developing this new document, these are some of the things, as part of this process, thinking about it. Really conveys what the student's done, has some of the traditional formats of a transcript so that people can read and understand it, verifiable. This issue will be a challenge for all the direct assessment schools. So I think that's one that we're watching pretty closely how that happens. Ability to drill down into the competency levels, have a document that you can look at. If your goal is just to validate that the student has a degree, that's fine, but if you want more information, it's available to you. So here's kind of an example of what this might look like. So you have John Doughboy working on 2 degrees and a certificate. The degree name, you can drill into that and go into what all the courses and competencies, and like I say, when they use the term course, that's their attempt to sort of map it to a more traditional approach. They are not doing courses as part of their delivery. And my guess is once the Department of Ed kind of navigates through how you provide your Phys app and meet your Title IV regulations without courses, they won't be doing this anymore. Again, more click into a box and you can go into the course name and see the learning outcomes. All of these, boxes could have, if there's information on them, they'll be lit up so you can drill into those for more. It can have 2 degrees with all the details in the same document. That's a little hard to discern from a traditional transcript. If you have 2 degrees, you'd have to figure out how the courses on that transcript contributed. Another one of our schools that's doing some pretty interesting work here is University of Maryland University College. And again, they are the adult learning online course, more than 75,000 students. It may actually be more like 90,000 students, big place. Anybody who's ever been a transfer credit evaluator and dealt with either service members or veterans knows this transcript, because University of Maryland does a lot of work with military students. That's a huge part of their enrollment. So as they're working through this project, this is what they sort of laid out. These are some of our objectives. They want this to be, registrar controlled, issued by the institution. It's got to be an e-transcript, has to be authentic. Some things in the future, shareable by the learner. Got to figure out how the learner takes control of this and is able to present it to whoever they want. Probably do it in a printable PDF file format as well, so that that's available. And what they are doing, there's a group called IMS Global. Are you familiar with IMS Global? They're the organization. I'll be honest, I didn't know them much until they approached us about 1.5 years ago. They're a standards organization that's done most of the interoperability standards for learning management systems. And from what I understand, their work's been very, very good, so that you can move information from LMSs, or at least LMSs all seem to have pretty common standards within them. They've gotten into this, and they're building what I would call something of a data warehouse that's a bit like a learning management system, but it's a data buzz that sits in the middle of everything that's taking place at the University of Maryland. And the idea being they want to be able to pull stuff from anywhere it's retained into this repository to be able to reach into that to populate their document. And that's been a little bit of a challenge. Yesterday I went to a session from Civitas. And Civitas may actually be one way of doing that. You were in that session. From what I understand, their main thing is creating an data integration tool in the middle of all their systems to pull LMS, SIS information. If you're using a CRM, you have to pull it into it. Actually, UMUC is a Civitas school, as is Central Oklahoma, which is one of our schools. So I think Central Oklahoma may try using Civitas as this data integration model to be able to pull those things into the record. If they do, that's really interesting. But that's what IMS Global is building for them. They're building this interface. So their kind of mock transcript is a little bit like what you saw for Wisconsin Extension. It has a front face that has links to it. Now this one is showing, they're using bars of progress toward that competency. If something's lighted, you can click on it and it provides a more narrative, detailed description of the learning outcome. It has these evidence buttons if students want to have documents or artifacts of their learning, their project, their video, etc. It can be there. And this is the artifact. So this is what would show up that you have there if an employer wants to see more detail about what you did as your group project. It's readily available. So I think when we come out of this, we're probably going to have 3 or 4 models. I think people are liking this infographic that Elon is doing, particularly around the 5 pretty common high-impact practices. We think we could standardize those in some format because they seem to be common ones that institutions want. Several of the campuses are really interested in what Stanford is doing with this e-certificate, being able to create some sort of smaller credential, package it in an electronic format that has detail. We have a couple of schools that are trying to figure out how to pull the learning outcomes and competencies into the record. Several of the e-catalog companies right now are providing the ability for you to put the learning outcomes of your course in the text of the e-catalog, so it's a place to pull it. Trying to think what the other, we have one school that's thinking about modifying the degree audit because of the fact that that it's there and they can't get away from it. But rather than organizing it around that the requirements are you need 3 humanities or you need 3 social sciences and 2 sciences, you organize it around the learning outcomes. And so as students are completing the courses, your requirement that says have cross-cultural understanding could draw courses from social sciences, humanities, et cetera. So at least as you're filling those, the student is consciously thinking, I have almost completed the cultural integration outcome rather than I have almost completed the humanities box. because I think that's kind of an old construct that we use. So here are a couple of things that I think are challenges and opportunities moving forward. One is this assessment movement is in very early stages. Again, as we tried to find schools that were actually operationalizing the degree qualifications profile, had a hard time doing it. I think, the idea to do this would be, for faculty to come together and deconstruct their degree, define the learning outcomes and competencies that they want, deconstruct it by building assessments, assignments, and classes that lead to that. We've not seen a lot of that, because if they had done that, then we could possibly have something to link to create a record from later. And if the assessment around academic learning is nascent, it's even more nascent in the co-curricular space. Right now, even if you look at Elon, I'll be perfectly honest, that isn't a representation of the learning, it's a representation of your activities. I did study abroad. I did leadership. I did an internship. Well, where's the evidence of the learning there? So there's a lot of work taking place now about building assessments about what is appropriate learning outcomes for a study abroad experience, for example. Internships, how can we find ways to do that? And actually, that's one that we think we could eventually build some standards around. In the electronic data exchange, we have standards for a transcript. That's been around for years. About 2 years ago, PESC released a standard for course inventory, so that now we can electronically, in a standardized format, exchange course descriptions. So if a student transfers and the receiving institution wants to know more detail, you can look at the course description. PESC just released a new standard for e-portfolios. So we'll be able to exchange electronically e-portfolios. As I mentioned, we just filed to have a new standard for e-certificates. So when you have those in place, then you could electronically exchange learning outcomes and those kinds of descriptions. And if we think we can get the academy to agree on some common assessments or outcomes around these co-curricular experiences, then perhaps they can exchange and transfer. Student has these 3, move to the next institution, you don't need to repeat those, and they can become part of your experience. The technology remains a challenge. As I said, the big one right now is this data integration across all of these systems, where they were not designed to do that. Very complicated. And so where we put the assessments, where we put the artifacts of learning, those are all kind of up for debate. And that's why we think we may be able to help with some of these models that we come out as at least an option as technology continues to evolve for where you find and pull that data. And again, the other one, the student information systems are not designed for this kind of work. They're really based on courses and terms. That's what it does. Although there are new products on the horizon that I think may shake things up a little bit. Another opportunity challenge, believe it or not everybody has bought into this idea. Faculty, I think even at Stanford, well, I say maybe Stanford isn't the right illustration, but Tom Black says about half of his faculty kind of think the outcome approach is a reasonable approach. When I say that, defining predetermined learning outcomes and kind of focusing on those. And you maybe aren't surprised that some registrars don't think this is a good idea. One sort of split that we've seen, we are partnering with NASPA. And now I came out of the admissions side. I was always a student affairs guy in my profession. And interestingly, if you survey enrollment management, at most institutions, enrollment management is under the provost. Only about 10% of schools is enrollment management under student affairs. But I was always a student affairs guy. Some of our registrars just think, oh, that's that touchy-feely student affairs stuff. That doesn't go on the transcript. We're not going to bring that in here. That's been a little bit of a problem. But then again, we've got people like Rodney Parks at Elon who have fully embraced this. Tom Black, registrar at Stanford, also happens to be the vice provost for student affairs. So he works in this. But I think this is one of the challenges that we have to have. We don't expect everybody to adopt these, and in many cases, you probably won't do anything differently with your transcript, although I would argue that all of our institutions need to make them digital and need to make them exchangeable in that format. And if you have more information about courses or the students, why not, in a digital format, link to that? That doesn't change the integrity of your transcript. How do we enable these new records to integrate with LinkedIn, social media, and other platforms? One of the challenges we've had people tell us is, why are you guys doing all this work? Quite honestly, well, let me ask the question. How many of you have ever had to send your transcript to an employer? Was the employer an institution? How many sent their transcript to a non-institution employer? Of course, I'm asking people who are in the academy. What we find is employers don't ask for transcripts. The academy does. I mean, this is our document. So people say, well, why are you trying to make this thing for a group that doesn't like them anyway? And most people tend to kind of quickly over time reduce what they describe as their college experience and replace it with work experience. I mean, on your resume, you probably, when you first came out of college, you had all sorts of stuff on there. And then slowly, you probably are like mine. My reference to my college experience has my degree and year. Doesn't have any of the other activities. So, people say, well, this might be helpful for the first job, but then it slowly becomes less relevant. So how are you going to make that document stay alive? Well, I think there's a couple of things out there that are on the horizon. One of them, Rick Torres didn't talk about it yesterday, but this is the gleam in his eye, is, again, what they're doing in the UK. This HERE report, when you graduate from a UK school and they produce this digital HERE report, you authorize to have it sent to, currently there are two companies that do this. One called GradIntel, which is a UK company, and the second is Digitary, which is a company out of Ireland. And they actually work with the schools to produce that digital record. But the student releases it, authorizes GradIntel to use their data as part of an employer match. And they have hundreds of companies that are going in and searching against those attributes that are in this file. And GradIntel will actually email you and say, Tommy, 3 companies pinged you as a possibility. Are you interested in pursuing those? They even have these pre-populated applications, and they do it on your behalf. So there's this really rich matching taking place. And over time, as they're analyzing the data, they're seeing which attributes tend to be most, resonate most with employers, and you're starting to see some impacts on what the students are doing at the campus. That's an interesting process. Again, for them, there's no transfer, so there's one document. So what do we do in the United States where, we have students that have attended 4 or 5 schools? Our approach is, if you're going to apply to a company, that company will say, please send us all 5 of those transcripts. If you apply to another school, please send us all 5 of those transcripts. We don't curate, we don't pull together. Well, I think Rick has this idea, and it's coming out of the reverse transfer project because of the fact that they've done 3 states, Missouri, Wisconsin, and Texas, where they've piloted the clearinghouse collecting course and grade data. They've now created this enormous repository that I think one of the future steps is that students will be able to pull records from multiple entities and populate it in this warehouse, and then sort of take control over this compiled record and add to it. If you decide to do industry, you heard Rick talking about all the industry certifications. Well, he'll be able to grab those, student puts it into this locker and suddenly has control over this. So I think that's going to be a big part of what happens. In lots of other countries, we're the ones that are fixated on the transcripts anyway. In Europe, that's not what they look for diplomas. You have your apostille, you verify your enrollment. They don't ask for transcripts. So I think that's going to be a big shift. And then this, will employers embrace what we're doing? You always hear the reference that something like 40%, in 10 years, 40% of the jobs that are out there have not been created yet. Well, how are you designing your curriculum to prepare for that? So, I mean, this notion that we're going to try and adapt to what employers want is a bit of a moving target. So that I think these last two things are a really interesting part of this conversation about if someone's going to need to retool themselves later, how do you do that? How do you combine it with a record? How can you present yourself in a more comprehensive fashion? So I think this is a pretty exciting time. By December of this year and moving into the next year, we should be able to at least present to the community 3 or 4 of these models for people to explore and see if they resonate with you. So that's what I have prepared. I'd be happy for any questions or discussion. Yeah.
Enjoyed your presentation. Really interesting stuff you folks are working on. I thought for a while that just to perhaps oversimplify things, I thought for a while that really what we're trying to teach people in higher ed is critical thinking. And then when we look at gen ed competencies across an institution, what we're really doing is looking at facets of critical thinking. And then all the coursework that we do are just examples. So like your example of the philosophy major and the computer science major who have the same competencies for the most part,
Yep.
right? Well, you learn critical thinking. Did you learn it via learning programming or via learning biology or whatever? As long as you can think critically, that's the important thing. But then we would need to build in some degree of content knowledge because there are some jobs, no job that I've ever had,
Yeah.
but some jobs do need content knowledge. And I'm wondering if you've seen folks thinking about how to capture abstract competencies versus specific content knowledge. That nursing example seemed like it came close.
Yeah.
And then how do you have comparability between schools that may unpack things at different levels of granularity?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because I've heard people talk about the competency movement is to kind of shift from what you know to what you can do. And I thought, well, I think you still need to both know and do, and not to forget about that. I think the nursing one is a pretty good example because that RN to BSN has been a track for years, and in fact, it was a really good candidate to move into this competency approach because lots of folks who are going from RN to BSN have been in the field for a long time. And they said, well, why do you have to take all these classes over again? You should be able to demonstrate knowledge, what you know about certain subjects, and then sort of fast track yourself to learn the things that might be missing. So I think that's a good example. I think you're absolutely right. And what does an artifact look like? Right now, I think we've sort of said a transcript is supposed to show what you know, but not necessarily what you can do. So I think there needs to be a good mix of that. I think that's one of the exciting things that both University of Maryland, University College, and Wisconsin will do for us because they're explicitly thinking about competencies, but trying to stay at least in a more conventional format as well.
I think you've given some excellent examples of how we can document learning outcomes in a meaningful way on the transcripts. In addition to being able to document those learning outcomes, a consistent request we've had from employers is that we be able to document soft skills for our graduates. So punctuality, the ability to even just basically interact within the classes. And that's something that we've struggled with looking at how to assess. Have any of the pilot institutions worked with that area?
I think our HBCU is working on that. That's part of what they have used the term, it's almost like a good citizen, being cordial, timely. I mean, that's sort of their goal, and they're trying to capture it. I haven't seen exactly how that's going to happen, but that has been a challenge, because one of the things you hear, it's funny, I hear both sides of the equation from employers. An employer will say, we don't need that person to have the technical skills. I can train them to do that. What I need them to be able to do is critical thinking, these kind of good practices. And then, of course, you hear on the other side, none of your students are coming to us with the technical skills we need, so we've got to go create these programs ourselves. So I think this tackling the soft skills and finding out what are the appropriate assessments to be able to know that a student has that, and then how do you represent that in a document. I think that's going to be a really interesting part of the process moving forward.
Thank you for your presentation. Traditionally, we've been so entrenched with the transcript and connecting it with employers. Traditionally, at least from my experience, an employer asks for a transcript only to verify that you actually went to where you said you went.
Yeah. Now you don't even need to do that because the clearinghouse will do that for you as a degree verification.
Right. So the usefulness for the employers is
Yeah.
really only a verification that,
Yep.
you have that, which falls through the crack. I've heard more than one story of people, electrical engineers, other, high-end type jobs, where the person didn't actually have that credential. They said they did at the beginning, learned it on the job, and have been doing it for 30 years. So there's one connection. The employers will find this more interesting because now you're connecting it to actual skills. The other place where this will become extremely valuable is only 27% of students who earn a degree actually work within the field
Yeah.
that their degree has relevance to. So this now connects, things that are outside the degree, again, making that connection with an employer that says, this person's a biologist, but let's see how this applies to whatever they end up in. So really fascinating, very useful content.
Parchment did a credentials summit about 2 months ago and brought a bunch of people in, and some of our folks were talking about the project, and then Anthony Carnival came up from the Georgetown Center for Workforce and basically just dissed this in terms of employers. Employers don't want this stuff. They don't want more information. They don't have time for it. They're going to be doing machine readable. They're going to scroll through and look for keywords. And I thought, that's a little cynical. I think actually, maybe in the big companies that are doing this mass hiring, but I think in companies that are really, truly struggling to get the right sorts of people to be able to go through and see a richer set of information and find matches, I think will be valuable. They do think, Carnival did think it might be good information for the institutions to help sort of refine some of the things that they're doing, but he doesn't think employers will want anything to do with this.
Great presentation, Mike. Thank you. I was just going to comment on the last interaction there. I think one of the reasons that employers don't care about transcripts is because they are irrelevant.
Yeah.
All I want to do is verify that there's no fraud. But out of the other side of their mouth, they complain that they're hiring students that don't have the skills and knowledge that they need.
Right.
And so as the transcript becomes more relevant to those kinds of things and it becomes machine processable, I think it will become more relevant, as you said.
Yeah.
2 questions. I wrote them down, so I got to. You talked about how you guys wanted to get out in front of this, and so you started this project with the Lumina grant, and you want to be ahead of the vendors. But at the same time, ultimately, the vendors are going to have to be involved in this. And so
Hallelujah, absolutely.
to what degree are the ERP provider, the Lucians and the PeopleSofts, engaged with you in this process so that as you come up with something meaningful, it then gets incorporated into the software platforms?
So one of the things we did with our schools is to make sure we have a pretty broad range of the SISs, and I think we have probably 5 different companies involved. We also have, at our next transfer tech meeting, which is in July, we've sort of teed this up partly because of this, but also just the general challenge that we have around ERPs right now. And it's a track that we're calling the future of the ERP. We're basically laying out that campuses have built, purchased these SIS systems that were supposed to be ERPs, and they didn't do what they were supposed to do, and we've bolted on 20 different applications to it. We're now finding ourselves more wanting to be around competencies and learning outcomes, and we're constrained by the technology. So we have Ellucian, Oracle, and Workday on the same stage for a plenary where we're diving into their roadmap. And one of the things that we're queuing up as the main conversation is, how are you adapting to these new formats that are coming out? What are your thoughts about a Salesforce? Right now, I don't know anybody that uses PeopleSoft's communication tool that's on the front. Almost everybody has bolted on some sort of modification. So now the challenge is, just in my opinion, I haven't seen the big vendors move unless it's federally mandated as a compliance issue, or there's something financial available to them to do it, to make it part of the baseline project. Now, Banner now has the transcript exchange platform from the clearinghouse, because they obviously saw that as a financial boon. But that is a huge challenge for us. They're definitely a lagging industry, and none of their products were designed for higher ed.
Second question, your third bullet, technology remains a challenge. In addressing that, you basically just said there are some interesting things on the horizon.
Yeah.
I wondered if you could expand on that.
So for me, I think this data analytics issue is the big one. Right, the Civitas presentation yesterday, that showed if you did that project, you'd have this really robust tool to be able to pull information from all of your systems, to be able to analyze students and intervene when they're struggling, for example. Right, I don't know how much that costs. Is anybody at Civitas school here? It's expensive. $200,000. Well, Quinn Sigamond, who was part of our project, is, and unfortunately not now because of their labor dispute, was partnering with MIT to build a data interface to do something of the same thing and make it free. Now, Tristan Denley from Tennessee, I always love him. He says, free like a puppy, free. You get handed this thing, and there's some work to do. But I think that's the interesting thing, is that right now we've got these companies that are doing this, but in this move toward open source approaches, if that data bus is readily available, and they're testing it on 3 or 4 different student information systems, they're testing it in Tennessee, they're testing it in Hawaii, they're testing it in Massachusetts. I think what they're proposing perhaps is to have a bunch of schools get together. You might pay to be part of the development, a little bit like Workday is doing right now to build this new student information system. They have a bunch of schools that are part of the development. I think that's the future that's interesting around technology, because as soon as somebody solves that and you get a place to pull data, that would be, a registrar would have easy pickings to pull whatever you want into a record. From the MIT project, I'm gonna think it's got kind of a funny, yeah. I'll think of it here. It's like Digitel or something to that effect. And they got their first money to do this off of a TACT grant, because they were trying to build some links to the workforce in the greater Boston area. That's the technology I think is going to really, really change things.
We have time for one more question.
Okay.
So first of all, as a registrar, I want to thank you for validating what wonderful, vibrant people we are.
There you go.
I'm curious about the piece you brought out about transfer, because I don't think that swirling student is really going to change much over the years. I think we're going to keep seeing students do that. I've noticed that faculty often struggle to even come to grips with the transferability issue of courses to get things aligned so that we can help those students progress through. How do you see, how can we help faculty be able to go now to an even higher level of agreeing on things like these higher labels and standards of competencies?
Yeah, one pilot that's taking place that I think is interesting that might contribute to that is the Witchy Passport Project. Has anybody heard of that? You know, the Western Interstate Commerce Commission, one of the regional compacts, is working with their Western schools, and I think they have the 13 Western states, on what they call a passport. And what that has happened there, community colleges and baccalaureates with faculty have come together and agreed on learning outcomes for suites of courses, primarily in more standardized format that we use for gen ed, the suites of humanities, social sciences, et cetera, and have created block agreements that if the student has that learning outcome, that outcome is transferable to the next institution within the Witchy region, and then that requirement is fulfilled, and you don't have to go in and do it on a course-by-course basis. I think that's an interesting idea. From what I understand, it's still the outcomes around the conventional buckets that we tend to call gen ed. You know, your 3 humanities, your 3 social science, your 2 social, your communication proficiency, your math proficiency. But it is at least a standards-based approach or an outcome-based approach, and seems to be working, and they've now taken that pilot nationwide. So now I have some mixed feelings about that, and it's primarily because if you saw Rick's data on some of the outcomes, students who transfer without their associate's degree are much less likely to earn a bachelor's degree. So does this sort of process encourage students to transfer early? I mean, to me, the better outcome is, which it doesn't seem like they have in Kansas, is a general education associate's degree. You know, the students actually complete the gen ed, and what you agree to carte blanche is completion of all your lower division gen ed, and you're a junior. But that pilot at Witchy, I think, is worth watching to see if it resonates with faculty.
Thank you very much, and let's give Mike a round of applause.